Hello and welcome to the Being Human podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Bottaro, and today's episode touches on something I think that we're all feeling. Our world is constantly keeping us connected, feeling like we're so connected. And yet so many of us are struggling with anxiety, loneliness, and a sense that there's something missing. After COVID, we all blame social isolation, and there is definitely a deepening of isolation. People are drifting further apart, yet we are so connected with our apps, with our news, with our phones, with our social media, with everything. So how do we get through this? How do we see through this? How do we connect really? How do we connect the dots between, especially our Catholic faith? Is our faith the key to reclaiming true mental health in all of these challenges of this new digital age, this new AI age, everything else that's happening? In this episode, I'm sharing insights from a powerful conversation I had with Max Studios podcast, connected with St. Thomas University, and they are doing some really groundbreaking work, some awesome stuff at UST Houston. And I love their programs. They're so innovative. Max Studios is amazing. And they've got Darnell Miller, who is the creative director for Max Studios, who interviewed me here for an event. And then they put that out. And so I'm gonna link to their show in the show notes here if you are interested in going deeper into what they're doing. They're bringing together a lot of awesome digital content. We talk about that in this episode. We don't throw away all of technology and everything else that the world is giving us, but we want to have more precise discernment. We have to have surgical precision with the proliferation of all these opportunities and everything that's been happening. So we'll talk about tackling the rise of depression and loneliness, finding peace as all of our anxiety is increasing. And I unpack what I think is really underneath this deeper restlessness and how we can rediscover real connection. So I hope this blesses you. This is a topic close to my heart. I hope that you are blessed by it, that you find it to be beneficial. I talk a lot about education and the place of education. If you're a teacher, if you know a teacher, or for parents, there's a lot that we get into here that has to do with kids and the educational systems in which they're embedded, the role of the family, things like that. So I hope you enjoy all of that. Send this to somebody that you think it might bless as well. And again, check out the show notes for links to everything we talk about. And until next time, keep us in your prayers as you are in mine. I spent the last 10 years learning how to help people using the best techniques available in psychology integrated with the Catholic faith. Now we've figured out that there's a better way to help people than just slapping a Catholic label on the same secular model of therapy you find anywhere else. The real question is, how will we make this shift to a new model of truly Catholic accompaniment, keeping the psychological sciences in mind while opening up to a more human and more effective approach? This podcast is here to give you the answer. Join me and follow along as I take you behind the scenes of what this new model looks like, using recorded audio from sessions working with my team, with colleagues, and even directly with clients. My name is Dr. Greg Bottaro, and I want to welcome you to the Being Human podcast.
Dr. Greg Bottaro, thank you for being here with us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This is great.
So before we get started, I want to have you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your history, how you got involved in the field of mental health.
Sure. Well, when I was in college, I first started really thinking about psychology as it applies to a profession. I was thinking about what to do the rest of my life, and I had already been working through some of my own anxiety. My family had gone through the tragedy of divorce, and I was, trying to make my way in college as a freshman. Who am I? What am I going to become? How do I make sense of what had just happened in my family? And by bringing a lot of those pieces together, I found this pathway forward that I thought would make sense for me. And that was, through the profession, or at least through the work of walking with people in their mental health issues.
It seems to me that there, at one point, I think it's changing now, but there was this idea that mental health was not compatible with the faith. I mean, part of it's because of the history of mental health and psychology in America.
Right.
But that's not the case, is it?
No, certainly not. I mean, in the U.S., especially, the history of the psychological field is rife with all sorts of really crazy hurdles and hiccups and really upside down ways of thinking. And so, it's very easy to see why there would be some hesitancy to listen to anything coming from psychology as a field. Mm-hmm. Now, I put in air quotes there because what that means is we're not talking about actual psychology or actual mental health. We would have the perspective in our Catholic faith that we are holistic, that we are body, mind, and spirit, and that we have a duty and a responsibility to steward well what God has given us. So we find in the writings of the church fathers, of the ancient, mystics and contemplatives of the church, and Eastern Catholicism, Western Catholicism, a lot of different ways to understand our interiority, what's going on in our mind, what's going on inside of us. So it's not to say that the church is antithetical to mental health itself, but in the 20th century in the U.S. especially, there were trends that certainly were antagonistic to the faith.
I think that's a really well and a really, really nuanced way to put it, because it's not so much like discounting everything that happened. It's saying like, hey, these things and the way they were approached did not offer the human person the dignity inherent to them.
Exactly.
And we need to change that element of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And that brings us to kind of what we're here today for. So you were here for the Duke and Altum Conference.
Yes.
And we're talking about stewarding our young people, helping them to understand and know faith, talking about Catholic education. And you're here to present on that too. So if you could just give us like a quick rundown of what are young people in education, young people in school, whether they're middle schoolers, high schoolers, what they're facing out there in this world today.
Yeah, it's pretty terrible what's going on, and people are starting to get hip to it. It's like we have books like The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt that just came out. Bad Therapy by Abigail Schreier recently came out. And so people are starting to wake up a little bit to how bad it really is. And Haidt says something interesting that, people will assume that this is a COVID issue and a lockdown issue and a social isolation issue. But actually, that's not what the data shows, that this is an issue that predates COVID, and things were getting worse already. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, COVID and lockdowns accelerated a lot of that. But what we're seeing today is a separation from humanity. There's a disintegration that is becoming really, really present. And so we have kids that don't know who they are or how to act. They don't know how to be human. And so a lot of what I'm doing in our work at CatholicPsych and the Being Human podcast, we call it Being Human for a reason, is sort of plumbing the depths of what it means to be human, to become reintegrated with our true self. Well, so we have, anxiety, depression. People for a decade have been talking about increasing rates of these kinds of mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And suicide rates were increasing. We see school shootings. We see these kinds of things that have been getting worse for years. Now, all of a sudden, we have other weird issues happening. We have the what we call somaticization of psychological issues. In other words, the body is now starting to hold and express a lot of this mental health distress. So we have, not just panic disorders, which were already increasing, but seizure disorders. Like kids are increasing and having seizures in the classroom. It doesn't even look like it's related to mental health, and maybe sometimes it's not, but in all, we see this level of distress is getting worse and worse. And so, we see this happening with social media. We see this happening with kids being stuck in their homes or just choosing to stay stuck in their homes, mm-hmm. not wanting to go out, not wanting to hang out with their friends. And all these things are sort of coalescing into this decrease of what it means to be human.
I think it's really interesting talking about the somatic stuff, talking about that's what they're feeling and what they're holding in their body. I think everybody, and maybe not everybody, but I think the vast majority of people have heard the Brene Brown quote, "The body keeps the score." And
Sure.
so there's that idea of like whatever stress they're holding into themselves, whatever anxiety they're holding on to, like needs to come out, manifest itself somehow. And either like we work out, we do things, we pray to help get all that out of us, or it just sits there and it becomes something else.
Exactly.
It becomes something different. And what you're saying right there, like, it's manifesting itself in seizures and different things like that. Like the body's trying to figure out what to do with all this extra energy, all this extra pressure, all this extra stress.
Yes.
How do we even begin to deal with some of that? Like, I know it's one thing when you're noticing it within yourself, but as a parent and you're seeing that in your child, like, what do you do?
Well, first of all, if we back up, we can understand that, yes, this is sort of more recent, although it's been a few decades. But, in 2010, I started my doctoral dissertation on a holistic conceptualization of looking at somebody with disorder and understanding the biopsychosocial, spiritual dimensions of the person. That's kind of a fancy way to frame who the whole person is. Yep. And, there was work by Brene Brown, by Bessel van der Kolk, talking about the body keeps the score. And the thing is, we already knew it. We've known it for centuries. Because what we're going back to, again, is a Catholic worldview, an anthropology of understanding our humanity through the lens of faith and reason, not just science. Now, along comes science, and they're sort of shooting in the dark at what it means to be human through the scientific method. And without a foundation on a philosophical and revealed truth about the human person, then you have to wait and see what happens when you run enough experiments. When you start with the foundation of what it means to be human through faith and reason, we're already well ahead of the game. So we already knew that there was a unity between body and spirit. Mm-hmm. We already knew that the psyche is in this place that lives between the two. And we already knew that anything that's happening in the body is going to affect the spiritual life. Anything that happens in the spiritual life is going to affect the body and vice versa, and also overlapping with that psyche in between. So we can read literally the Desert Fathers and come up with the same answers of the body keeps the score. And so we have to realize that we have in the tradition of our faith such treasure. And when the world gets more and more confused about what it means to be human, to the point of what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? All these other questions now supposedly are arising that we as a culture don't know the answer to, but we have the answer. And so that's where we need to look first. And then we let the science, of course, build on those foundations of faith and reason. And so that's what real integration should look like. That's what we're trying to do at the Catholic Psych Institute. So what do? We have to think about what does that perspective teach us about who we are? And if we start to think about the spiritual dimension and this transcendence that we're created for, it brings open a whole new potential for what we could do with our life. We're made for something beyond what's here. Are we thinking about that? Do we live our life putting out fires, running around like chickens with their heads cut off, scrambling from problem to problem without ever taking a step back to think about the bigger picture? What am I really made for? Where am I going in my life? Because if we don't actually take that step back, we miss it. And because of the way we understand our anthropology, if we're not connecting to that intellectual, spiritual pursuit of the things that are transcendent, then we will not know how to line up our bodies on a trajectory that brings us to real happiness.
And so all of that right there, this idea of we're made for something more, I think that's something that, at least when I think of my own childhood of growing up, I mean, other than my parents saying those things to me, right? Like, I was not prepped for that in school. Sure. They were saying like, okay, like what you can do is you can study really hard and you can become a doctor. Why? Because doctors make good money. Right. You could be an engineer. Why? Because engineers make good money. You
Yes.
could become a scientist. Why? Because scientist, like that was like what the prep was, right? That was what they were teaching us what to do. That's what they were teaching us, like prepping us for, like, why do I do this work? Not because I can help people, not because I can heal, not because I can offer anything else.
Right.
But so that it seems like that mentality kind of travels forward with us. Like if we're missing out on like the more that we can do, of that we can help people see Christ, we can help people on their journey to heaven,
Right.
as something that's like that's what we're called to. If we miss that in our childhood, it seems like we missed that. It's hard to refigure that out later in life.
Sure.
So I think of like when we're talking about here at this Duke and Altum conference, we're talking about educating our youth, teaching them that at the very beginning of like, what are you called for? Like, yes, you could be a doctor, but if you're a doctor, you're here to heal people the way Christ heals us. You're called to be a lawyer. You're here to help impart justice because that's what we're called to as people, because God wants justice.
Yes.
And so reorienting every step of our life, every move that we make, reorienting it back towards Christ. And in doing that, that's helping them understand the role in a way. It's like, yeah, it's nice to have money and it's nice that you can do something with that, but that is not the goal in and of itself.
Right.
So how do we start integrating that for our youth, for our young people?
Well, honestly, we have to return to integrating it for our youth, because this is precisely what Catholic education means. I mean, everything you're describing is what Catholic education should be. It's what it was, and it's what it can be. And so, when you're describing what you were raised with and how you didn't have that understanding, then it sounds like you didn't have at least a good Catholic education.
I didn't. I went to public school.
Well, there you go. And so what do we need? We need Catholic education. We need a Catholic framework for understanding our full humanity, our full potential, our full identity. This is something that happens in mental health when people, I work a lot with people. Obviously, anxiety is a big part of what people come to us with, right? And I developed a program called Catholic Mindfulness. Mindfulness is a protocol used to reduce anxiety. It's used a lot of times in inpatient hospitalization. It's used in groups outside of the hospital. And now it's become kind of a pop psych fad. And so, sometimes people will practice this and it's like, well, it works for a little while, but then it's not really working anymore. And then I ask, well, what do you believe about the world? What do you believe about God? What do you believe about what happens when you die? And if somebody doesn't have a Christian worldview, then I say, you should probably be a little anxious. Like, what happens when you die? That's not a problem to be anxious if you don't have an answer to that question. When you have an answer to that question, then we have no reason to be anxious. In fact, Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:25, do not be anxious about the things of your life. He's commanding us to not be anxious. But the whole premise is that we have a Father in heaven who loves us, who takes care of us. If you don't have that worldview, you should be anxious because death's coming and you can't escape it. And even in your subconscious, whether you've blocked it out of your mind or not, that eventually this is going to end. But if you have a worldview that makes sense of that, we have a God who entered into this experience of death to actually die and then overcome it and conquer death, so that we now have a pathway to also conquer death through union with him. That's the framework that matters. Well, how do you learn that? How do you make that integration and application? You make it with Catholic education. So the whole point of Catholic education is it's a framework for our true humanity and identity, then applied to anything else that we need to do. Just like you said, doctors, lawyers, but even the most basic fundamentals of what is the purpose of education itself. Because then we have a framework to understand what's the role of the family. So is the school the primary educator of the child? Absolutely not. The family is. So what role does a school have in providing this beautiful Catholic education? It has the role of collaborating with and supporting the responsibility of the family, who is the primary educator. That's what we get from a Catholic worldview. Also missing from the school systems. So what happens when you have a public school system that overrides the family? This is grossly anti-human and disintegrated. But we wouldn't know that. It doesn't work. It never works. Historically, it's never worked. We already know that because we have the foundation of anthropology. We know how we're made. We know who we are. And so that's what it means to have Catholic education. That's why I love organizations like Duke and Ultim. They're bringing together support, networking, resources, and honestly, in a way that I feel like is pretty rare in our culture, where you have an organization just serving.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I love the DIA conference because you just have this positive spirit in the room of people who just want to support and help and serve each other. And that's something that even in nonprofits, sometimes it's like, all right, how are we going to get the funding? How are we going to get new benefactors on board? How are we going to promote our thing? And it's like Duke and Ultim is a kind of place where they almost kind of disappear into the background. And they just highlight all of the other organizations that are here and create the connective fiber and the tissue so that they can become mutually supportive. So that's what that, and also, by the way, that aligns with our Catholic anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
We are made to be in communion with each other, not to be self-serving, not to be self-serving, but to be self-gift. And if we really think about relationships that we have with each other, it's like, how am I serving the other? That's literally what Jesus said. I've come to serve, not to be served. And we're supposed to follow him. So we can do that individually, we can do that in our families, we can do that in our school systems, and we can do that in our organizations that are built to support systems.
And it seems to me that this idea of coming together of community is, it's a beautiful thing too, but it's also, they're not even here, they're here to help each other, but they're here to help each other serve a different demographic, to serve the student population, to learn from one another, so that way they're better equipped to help somebody else out. So it's not even like we're doing this to help each other out. It's like we're helping each other help somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. That's the goal.
Which is even more beautiful than just like, yeah, we're here to help each other.
Right.
But so you talk about this idea of community. And I know that's a topic of conversation right now, because right now we're in an epidemic of loneliness.
Yes.
People are having hard times connecting. I mean, with their family members, having hard times connecting with friends. We're seeing more and more people who aren't in relationships with, they don't have boyfriends, they don't have girlfriends, they're not getting married. They're not even in communion with themselves oftentimes, right? Just choosing to push off whatever reality is, numbing themselves, spending time on social media, in video games, and in faux worlds, as opposed to like living their own lives.
Right.
And how is this sense of community the antidote to that isolation, to that loneliness?
Well, first of all, if we really want to dissect that a little bit more, if you think about how outrageous and ironic and paradoxical this is, that the sort of woke culture is creating isolation through this increase of sensitivity to things that we don't like in other people. Mm-hmm. And so it's a kind of a weird thing that's happened. But in the 90s and 2000s, there was the buildup of a different kind of psychology called positive psychology. Mm-hmm. And it was starting to get traction. And positive psychology talked about building resilience. And it looked at the difference between, started in the military. It was looking at soldiers who go to war and suffer PTSD versus soldiers who go to war, experience the same events, but don't come home with a diagnosis of PTSD. Mm. And this is a really fascinating study when you start to think about, whoa, two people see the same terror. One person comes home and is fragile and depressed or anxious or needs to avoid situations. Their relationships are crumbling. And then you have this other person who comes home and they're thriving, because the old adage rings true for them, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What's the difference? So positive psychology was set out to actually study that question and come up with an answer. And they came up with an answer. And so we have these qualities that make up a person who is resilient versus a person who suffers PTSD. And they realize that traumas can actually turn to post-traumatic growth instead of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Now, some reason between the 2010s to 2024, it's like that whole movement disappeared. And instead, we started to build up ways in which we can make the difficult situations go away. And somehow it becomes the goal and the aim not to develop stronger resilience so that we can suffer things that happen. Because, by the way, those qualities of resilience that made the difference between those soldiers can be taught and they can be learned. And then they can actually create resilience in people that didn't otherwise have it. That's actually possible,
Yeah.
which is why millions and millions of dollars went into funding this for soldiers, because that's actually a more effective use of funding than having to heal PTSD for soldiers who are coming home already affected. Let's build up the resilience before we send the soldiers to war. That makes sense. But then again, somehow that just disappeared. So now instead what we have is a culture that's a cancel culture. Now we need safe spaces. Now we're becoming so uncomfortable with somebody who disagrees with me. And that something's wrong if somebody disagrees with me. And instead of saying, wait a minute, that is childish, that needs to be grown out of, that needs to be trained out of, if for some reason that's really hard for somebody, and it's understandable if it is, but we can train people out of that, and we as a culture should support training people out of that, not the opposite, which is what's happening right now. So now everybody's on edge, everybody's scared, everybody now has gone, even the people who could have been resilient are now learning how to be fragile. And this is the distinction, and this is why this is such a paradox, is that at the end of the day, everybody's going to disagree about something. But the way that this cultural movement is working is that it creates a paradigm in which somebody has to be exactly like you in order to stay in relationship. If they're not like you, now they're toxic. Now we have to cut them out. Now we have to have boundaries. It's like a complete hijacking of a good term, like boundaries. But now it's like, now I have to protect my bubble where the only people that I actually interact with are people that I don't disagree with or don't disagree with me. And if you follow that through to its extreme, you end up with the only way to have relationship is to have somebody who's exactly like you, which is the opposite of the definition of relationship, which is always going to be with somebody who's not like you. Because we're unique. So how do we be in a place that we're with somebody who's different, but it's okay to be with? It has to be the opposite of what our culture is doing right now.
Yeah. And even then, like that natural progression of like even being with yourself because you're unique, we change over time. Our ideas shift. We grow.
Sure, exactly.
I mean, in theory, we grow, right? We can choose not to, I guess.
Well, that's fascinating because think about people who have, like now, they have to look back, celebrities that have to look back at things they said
10 plus
10,
years
15
ago.
years ago.
Yes.
And it's like, how do you live with yourself when you see what you said 15 years ago? It's like, and maybe they're growing in the wrong direction. Usually that's when that comes out. Is like, I can't believe I said this or that. It's like, well, you can believe it because that was a different cultural context.
Yes.
And now, okay, maybe you correct things, but like you can live with yourself.
Yeah, and it's one of those things like say you did say something and it was outlandish and it was completely wrong, and you're just like, actually, yeah, I did, like that was wrong.
Right.
I don't do that anymore because I know that that's not a thing to do.
Sure, but I can still love myself.
Yes.
Be in communion with myself, knowing that this is something I needed to grow out of.
Yes.
And, okay, so sometimes our differences mean somebody's right, somebody's wrong. Sometimes it's just a cultural difference. Sometimes it's an experiential difference. At the end of the day, we have to be able to stomach differences.
So you said that there was a moment between that positive psychology to what we have. Like, what was that shift? What do you think that was? Or are we still like not sure of like a defining moment that swapped it?
I think it was social media.
Okay.
And it was the rise of a phone-based culture that Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book, The Anxious Generation. And what happens with the phone-based culture is you can connect with people who are of the like mind in a superficial way. So it creates the illusion that I've sort of found my people, found my tribe. And you get used to interacting with a lot of people who aren't going to disagree with you on that superficial point.
Yeah.
Instead of being in your neighborhood with your neighbor that might like the same sports team, but also has 12 different ways that they differ from you. They don't have the same family background. They don't like the same food. They don't have the same family traditions. And it's like, okay, you hang out to watch the Astros game or whatever, and then you also, fight about, what other parts of your life differ, and that's okay. So if we're living in that kind of culture, it's like that nurtures the building of resilience. But then you separate out from the actual real relationship with people where these other things might come up. And it's like, I'm just in the Astros Facebook group, or I'm just on the Instagram, or I'm just on the DMs for people who like whatever. And then that's where you spend all that time.
We've condensed our interests down into into singularities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it stays in that superficial world.
Yeah.
So we don't learn that it's actually okay to be with people who we disagree with on certain things.
I think that's something that our faith also offers. That's a very unique thing. That's a necessary thing, right? Like our sacraments are not to be administered virtually. Like we have to be there and receive them in person. There's something valuable about being there in person. Something that's like if you took that piece away, like they're not licit anymore. Like that, and it's because Christ was communal,
right?
And he required that of his apostles, because that is just the way things have to be. That is how you learn. That is how we grow. That is how we experience the love of God in the world around us. We can't experience that love by ourselves in our rooms, never interacting with anybody.
Exactly. So that's ultimately the antidote. Is we have to reverse the play-based culture, the phone-based culture, and that's what the anxious generation offers as a solution. It says we need to return to a play-based culture.
Yeah,
and play for children is the beginning of testing out what it means to relate to others, and it also means getting to know oneself. So you learn your own limits, you learn creativity, you learn being challenged, you learn how to face risks, take risks, get hurt. You learn how to pick yourself back up after you've gotten hurt. That's all just individually. And then you apply another person to that paradigm. And now you have two people together taking risks, getting hurt,
building trust and
confidence. Exactly. And so then, we've ripped that out of the developmental process for kids.
Yeah.
Some of the best Catholic schools that I know are these new startup programs, these classical Catholic curriculum, or these charter schools. A lot of them are just making the kids go outside and play for 3 hours a day.
That's
and
awesome.
It's the most important thing to do if you're starting a new educational program. And so we need kids to play, and we need to take away phones. We have to get kids off the screens, because and I love technology. And the church loves technology. And there's an awesome document called The Church and the Internet, even about the internet. The church is pro-internet and pro-technology. But we have to be very careful and prudent in its use. And so there's something that's even a greater good, like the access to information, can become a greater evil when it's actually creating an illusion of connection to other people. And so that's where it's become really evil. And so we need to stop allowing ourselves and our kids to be pulled into this illusion of connection to other people.
And so we mentioned social media within this. And like you said, like there is a good in that, but there's also the far end of like what it can be and how it can be destructive and how it could lead to anxiety, how it could lead to all those stresses. And I mean, I think about my own experience. I was old enough to like, I think in high school we had MySpace, and that was like the first social media, and like it was still pretty communal because like you listened to people that you really liked, you could put your music on there. Like it was still very like you could go into the back end and put in your HTML code to customize it, so you weren't getting like a little cookie cutter feed. You're building it out and expressing yourself, and just kind of experimenting with that, and it was fun and not very much pressure. But then I think of like if I had to grow up like at the same age. With Instagram as it exists today, that would have been crippling. That would have been so much harder.
It's sucking the life out of our kids. And the thing is, like, humans are actually resilient in a certain sense, that we are incredibly sophisticated at pivoting and adapting to the circumstances. So in some ways, what we're seeing as the mental health distress and the disorders are actually the body and mind's way of reacting to the new environment that we're immersing our kids in. And so in a certain sense, becoming socially isolated and having social anxiety is a defense mechanism. So we're going to adapt to the situation that we're placed into. So we couldn't ever sort of go back and be immersed in the culture that the kids are in today. Like, we would crumble because we've already developed patterns of interactions and we've been formed in the culture that we were formed in. And so you can try to relate to other cultures, but it's never going to be the same as being formed in a particular culture.
Yeah.
So the kids today are developing all of these situations, which is what happens when you take a human person and take them out of these healthy formative experiences like play and relationship, and instead you put a screen in their hand and isolate them from others. And now this is what we're getting.
So the last thing I want to ask you then is, what steps can either like a parent take, or even like for people like we have, college students here who are still going through those same things, who are, spending time on social media and it's affecting them. What steps can they take to put themselves in a position where they could relearn community, where they can kind of step away from the pressures of what social media dictates for their life and live a fuller, more authentic experience?
Yeah, you can get a flip phone that doesn't have a screen, and you don't have to play the game of social media. And you find people who are like-minded, but I've been saying this for 10 years. And parents think I'm crazy. 5 years ago, 8 years ago, whenever I started saying these things, people looked at me like I had 3 heads, like I'm so out of touch, like I'll never get it. I don't have kids yet that are old enough to understand. I still don't. My oldest is 11 right now. But it doesn't matter when you know that they're drinking poison. So when you know that it's poison, you stop giving it to your kids. When you know that it's poison, you stop drinking it yourself. So I'll keep saying the radical thing for the next 10 years, and eventually, now thank God, these other studies are starting to catch up. People are starting to realize this. It's like, finally, it's more reasonable now to take the radical approach. You can get rid of the phone. You can get a phone that's not a computer. Just a phone. Phones are great. Communication between people using a telephone or a mobile phone is actually a wonderful thing. Even maybe having an app that gives you directions when you're lost. Okay, fine. But we go on and on and on with all this other stuff. We have to recognize the illusion of social media and that it's actually poison. So even something like a podcast, it's like, okay, is there a place for this? Absolutely. In history, you have ways of learning. This is like reading journal articles or reading books. We are filling our mind with good information. That's a beautiful, wonderful thing. Audio listening to information is a wonderful thing. When you're sitting there binging hours upon hours upon hours of entertainment through podcasts, now it's a problem. If somebody's in their room binging decades worth of research journals, and they don't have any relationships in their life, well, we would say that's a bad thing. We would recognize that as maybe being a bit disordered. So it's not about a sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater approach. It's about knowing what is the poison and extracting the poison, not ingesting the poison anymore, and then letting the good thing be good.
Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
My pleasure. It's awesome to be here with you. Thanks for listening to the Being Human podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to help us spread the word and hear more, please head over to iTunes, leave us a review, and subscribe, as it really helps us to get our content out to more people. Be sure to listen next time as I take you deeper into what it means to be human. If you want more free content and information about what we do at the Catholic Psych Institute, head on over to CatholicPsych.com. God bless you.